Good afternoon. Welcome to Church of the Resurrection. We have been privileged to host the UMC Next conference for the last 3 days. It's been a very exciting time of dreaming about what our church can become, our church as a whole, the United Methodist Church. I'm going to turn the program over to members of the convening team who are going to introduce themselves and share some comments regarding what brought us here and where we're going, what we have accomplished. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker.
Thank you, Kathy. My name is Junius Dodson, and I am General Secretary for Discipleship Ministries, and I'm thrilled that you are here. Thank you so very much for covering UMC Next. We just finished an amazing meeting. So we're happy to share some of the things that happened at this meeting. I first want to begin by giving you a little bit of the background. What was the impetus that brought us together? In February, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church held a special session in St. Louis, Missouri. That session was held to decide whether we should allow marriage ordination for our LGBTQ members, also dealt with issues of human sexuality. During this session, a majority, by a narrow margin, voted on what is known as the traditional plan, which will become church law beginning January of 2020. The traditional plan basically voted to affirm the current language in our Book of Discipline that says the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, also prohibits same-gender marriage and ordination. The traditional plan also goes another step further in that it not only retains the current language, but it also adds some punitive measures. And some of those punitive measures is to suspend and potentially remove clergy who do not comply with those rules. And so it was that impetus, that decision of the special called General Conference that brought together, energized a tremendous amount of people and a tremendous amount of churches, and that number is growing every single day. And UMC Next gathered over the next 2 days to be able to talk about our next steps.
Hi, my name is Karen Prudential. I'm with the New York Annual Conference. I'm also chair of Methodists in New Direction. We gathered here because of the decision of what happened at General Conference, which was not acceptable. And we came together to discern a better way forward for the United Methodist Church. And this gathering really was for a movement. This movement was a tipping point, and that's what happened this week. We came together and held many important things that were in tension, but we created and managed this ambiguity and cared for the waves of our own emotions and our own reactions to what happened. And we hope to accomplish more.
My name is Ginger Gaines Sorelli. I serve as senior pastor of Foundry United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. We gathered here in this space with more than 600 participants coming from every United States annual conference who were asked to bring the fullness of who they are into the discussion. Our time together included powerful testimonies that reminded participants of the history of schism in the church, the sin of racial segregation, discrimination against LGBTQ siblings, the struggle for gender equality, and the painful history of the use of the Bible as a tool for exclusion. We also shared stories of radical love and transformation that we've experienced. The meeting included polls taken by the body to understand the diversity that was in the room and to share insights and opinions. Table discussions which were a large part of our time shared together, centered on our hopes for the church. An overarching question throughout our time together became, if not us, who? And if not now, when? We considered together possibilities for the future of the church, including the implications, intended consequences, and the unintended consequences of those possibilities. Our conversation together over these days has been challenging and sometimes uncomfortable, but filled with hope, with deep faith, and commitment to what God has in store for us.
My name is Reverend DJ Del Rosario. I serve in the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference. My pronouns are he, him, his. We have identified at least two possible approaches as we move forward toward a new expression of Methodism. One approach is resisting as a faithful response to the actions of General Conference and as a means for accomplishing our goals for our Reformed Church. The second is negotiating some form of separation in order to create something new.
One of the biggest accomplishments I think we all are very excited about is that over the course of our time together, we discerned and affirmed 4 commitments of UMC Next. We believe these commitments are essential to a hope-filled future for the global Methodist movement as we make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. First, we long to be passionate followers of Jesus Christ, committed to a Wesleyan vision of Christianity that's anchored in Scripture and informed by tradition, experience, and reason as we live a life of personal piety and social holiness. Second, we commit to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in all forms and towards all people, and to build a church which affirms the full participation of all ages, nations, races, classes, cultures, gender identities, sexual orientations, and abilities. Third, we reject the traditional plan approved at General Conference 2019 as inconsistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ and will resist its implementation. Fourth, we will work to eliminate discriminatory language and the restrictions and penalties in the discipline regarding LGBTQ persons. We affirm the sacred worth of LGBTQ persons. We celebrate their gifts and commit to being in ministry together.
My name is Adam Hamilton. I'm the senior pastor here at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. This event was one of thousands of conversations that have happened since General Conference in St. Louis. We have had across the country folks coming together, United Methodists coming together to say, this is not okay. What happened at General Conference is not okay. To continue to treat LGBTQ persons as second class within the church, to hurt them. We came back to our local churches, and most of our churches, or many of our churches, have families, LGBTQ families, children. We have couples that are married, raising children in the churches, and we said to them, it's not okay with us anymore. It was not okay before, it's definitely not okay now. We are not going to treat you as second-class people in our midst. Our attendees worked collaboratively to dream and think about what this church should look like in the future, and then to envision and to imagine, how do we get there? How do we create a church that is welcoming of everyone who walks in the doors, that is a church that embraces LGBTQ persons and their families and friends? Our attendees are returning home to their annual conferences, mobilizing in contextual ways. So they're looking to see, how do we do this? What do we do to work towards this kind of church in our particular annual conference? Convening team members will report out on our substantive work, and we will offer revised guidelines and guiding principles by email today. And this fall, the Church of the Resurrection will be hosting our annual Leadership Institute, and we will be focusing in that institute around how do we prepare leaders to lead into the kind of church that we are envisioning and dreaming about. We hope to have 3,500 pastors and church leaders here this fall in September for that event. We're very excited about the kind of church that we've been dreaming about and believe that God has great things for the United Methodist Church, and we want to be a part of that. I believe at this time we're going to be taking questions.
So if you have questions, if you want to step up to the mic in the center, we'll also be taking some questions that are coming in online.
This is Heather Hahn from the United Methodist News Service. It's great to see you all. One of the big parts of the conversation that's happening in the United Methodist Church right now is that we're a global denomination. So this was a US-based event, right? No, I mean, not just US, but everybody here was from the US. What are you going to be doing? What are next steps for involving the global church? And for those watching at home, folks here know this, but there are a lot of folks, particularly in Western Europe, who would be in agreement with everything you said.
I'll jump in. So we have been in conversation with people from around the world. We thought we would start this conversation, since there are multiple conversations happening at the same time, and this is not the only conversation taking place in the United Methodist Church. We wanted to start with the U.S. church here. We've been in conversation with the Europeans about the same opportunity. Actually invited some, but they were in the midst of their own conferences. There are conversations going to be happening in Chicago, we think, with members of the Central Conferences, bishops of the Central Conferences coming up in July.
I would also say first by saying salamat po. In my native tongue, that's how we say thank you for your question. I would say that one thing that's been wonderful about our time and space here is we're learning just how many wonderful networks we have. One of the things we love about the United Methodist Church is our global connection, and we definitely want to lean into that wonderful gift.
Thank you.
David Burke from the Great Plains. Thanks, everyone, for your time. Will the work that's been done here in the last 48 hours manifest itself in annual conferences? I mean, ours in the Great Plains starts next week, and we're entering annual conference season now. Is the turnaround going to be very quick, and what can annual conferences expect because of this meeting?
Thank you for that. I know that in the Baltimore-Washington Annual Conference, of which I'm a part, the folk who were here representing that conference are already talking about having a meeting this coming Monday on Memorial Day, because our conference is next week. So there is energy flowing out of the conversation and the work that's happened over these days, and I believe it will definitely be taking some form. I don't know, I mean, it's a quick turnaround for a lot of our folk, but I believe that we will be seeing these conversations happening in substantive ways and affecting what's happening in our annual conferences in the weeks to come.
And I also believe, my name is Junius Dodson, that if you think about energy and the energy that happens when people come together and they're passionate, these people are passionate about a hope-filled future, passionate about a church that is inclusive and that is eliminates forms of oppression. We are passionate about a church where all can be included. Now, I also want you to understand that we're also passionate followers of Jesus, and we have a deep desire to make disciples of Jesus Christ. But we also believe that all of those disciples should be able to participate in the transformation of the world, in that transformative work. So I think you will see that these conversations will continue beyond this place. They're going to ripple out into annual conferences all across this country, and people are going to be discerning faithful ways to respond to the actions of General Conference.
So I'll just add one more thing. We broke up, our last conversation here was biannual conference. So every annual conference had 10 folks, at least 10 folks here, and they had a chance to dream together and strategize. What we agreed upon were these 4 principles, And then we said, okay, it's time for us to dream in our annual conferences. How do we live into a church like that? What does that look like? And so it was fun to watch the energy and to see people excited about going back to their congregations. We had 2,000 more people want to come here than we could fit in the room for this gathering. And so they're going to go back and mobilize and get together with those other folks who wanted to be here, and then a whole lot more in looking to see how do we accomplish these 4 things in our church, in our local setting. Thanks.
How were the 10 selected from each conference?
Yeah, so we started, we had a couple of preliminary events in Dallas and Atlanta with folks that we knew were interested in this conversation, key leaders in the denomination, including bishops, general secretaries, other key leaders. And they began to brainstorm some of those names. Then we looked to the Uniting Methodist, and that was another organization where we had over 5,000 United Methodists who had said, we're in favor of a different future for the United Methodist Church. So we looked for that through that list. Then we opened up the nominations, and we, through a blog post, we had almost instantly, within a day or so, we had 2,000 people who self-nominated. So from all of those, we began to narrow down that list. And again, tried to have a diversity of age, ethnicity, LGBTQ, as well as cisgendered persons, and large church pastors, small church pastors, laity, and clergy. So the goal was as much diversity as possible, and clearly in the room there was probably about 65% of the people were in the centrist category, and about 35% who were more progressive.
For reference sake, how many bishops were in attendance?
Yeah, there were between 10 and 14 bishops.
All right.
I didn't count.
Thanks.
Panel, we have one question coming in from the Washington Post. You mentioned 2 possible approaches, resisting or leaving to form a separate denomination. When do you expect to make that choice between those 2 options? What's the process after this?
I think it's important to understand that we, at this stage, are not trying to say there's one thing, there's one path. We're aware that there are going to be multiple conversations that continue to happen and that we need to continue to develop. Even in this beginning conversation, we started with a few potential visions or paths or plans for the body to think about. But even trying to get the folk in this room clear about the potential consequences, both intended and unintended, over the course of 2 days was a very difficult challenge. So there's a lot for us to continue to work through and to think through. And we're going to likely need to be working at least 2, and we use that language very carefully, at least these 2 plans and 2 visions or directions, and also to be looking at other visions that came forward over the course of the 2 days. So there are people who submitted other plans for us just to take a look at and to begin to pray over. We're going to be working intentionally. We don't have it all worked out yet, but we're going to be working very intentionally to engage the amazing skills and gifts of members that were here to help us continue to develop these things. But I think that the main point is that we're going to not have just one plan. We never intended to come out of this with one plan. We knew that there were going to need to be multiple ways for folks to be engaged as we continue to lean into and try to discern where we'll land.
I might add to Ginger's response. There are churches who feel a great urgency that they need to leave now. There are churches and maybe some annual conferences where there are people who are hurting in their annual conference or in their local church, and they're not going to wait anymore. They're losing members every day who are saying, this is painful, and we're tired of waiting. We can't continue to wait. So we recognize that there are some for whom there's a blessing for them to be able to go and leave and to stay associated with us, to find some way to continue to be associated. But there are a large number of churches who say we couldn't leave. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't leave. It's just our church is divided or our annual conference is divided, and that's not a possibility for us. And so we really have 2 different approaches, and ultimately we'll probably have several different pathways forward. But these 2, as Ginger has mentioned, that some are going to ultimately leave, but we're going to look at resisting, staying, and living into a better, brighter way forward for the United Methodist Church, regardless of what the Book of Discipline says.
I also want to add to that, even though there might be a couple of approaches, we are headed in the same direction. And one thing we clearly are all going to be working on is an inclusive and just church. We're all very clear about that. We're also very clear about resisting the actions of the Special Call General Conference. So that we're headed in the same direction.
John Coleman, Eastern Pennsylvania Conference. With that in mind, the core principles that you presented, was there a consensus more or less? I suppose you surveyed the body to see how they felt about that. Was there more or less of a consensus of agreement with those same core principles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a groundswell of energy around these core principles. People contributed to trying to wordsmith them and their ideas, but we're all agreed on these general principles as ideas that ground us in our direction. They help to give us a clear sense of the future, a clear sense of where we're headed. So most definitely these principles do ground who we are as believers in Christ Jesus.
I have a question that came in from online. We all know that the United Methodist Church's problems are not limited to its exclusion of LGBTQ persons. Did those gathered at UMC Next discuss the bigger picture of a denominational structure that isn't aligned to the missional opportunities of the church today?
Thank you for that question. One of the things that was wonderful about our time together was we learned that there's something beautiful we can learn when we talk with our colleagues and with our communities and with individuals and with churches and take the time to listen rather than talk about people as if they're a complete other. God was doing amazing things as we sought to understand what the Holy Spirit was doing in our midst, and we knew it was an imperfect process. And yet, as we processed together, it was beautiful to watch people graciously and actively trying to lean in and learn from one another, and that we could also expand those networks so we can hear what a wonderful global church we have.
You know, when we started, we weren't sure how this was going to end, especially with people from a very huge spectrum of where people come from, whether contextually, ethnically, And the beauty of it is that we had authentic conversations here on hard topics, and we came out almost as one group. And that's why you have these four lines of statements that are really important on how we move forward together as a group. And I think that is what happened these last few days. The Holy Spirit came. That's how I really believe.
I might add one thing to that, and that is we recognize creating a more inclusive church does not transform the denomination and move us from decline to growth. We recognize that there's a lot of reform that has to happen in the church. This is one of the huge stumbling blocks for reaching younger people. It's one of the sources of pain for many people. But there's a lot more that is problematic in our denomination that needs to be reformed. Our system, our structure, our reclaiming our Methodist mission and our identity, all of those are pieces, but they weren't the bulk of the conversation we were having here today. So what we're looking at is there are things that we are seeking to address immediately related to the General Conference, and then we understand there's a whole lot more that needs to be reformed within the United Methodist Church to create a dynamic, vital Methodism for the 21st century.
Do you expect that will generate resolutions to the next General Conference that will come out of these efforts?
Yeah, I think we're anticipating that there will be resolutions coming for the General Conference. Those have to be submitted by September 15th, and so we're anticipating that there'll be working groups. And we really, we're just coming off of this. The plan will be to look at what kinds of working groups need to be formed. But we're also going to be supporting the work of others who are doing this as well. So Uniting Methodists and others are working together for the same thing. We don't see us transplanting, taking the place of all of those, but instead coming alongside them as well in the kinds of proposals that will be submitted to General Conference.
One more question. This convening team, how many of you actually are? I mean, we see the 5 of you. Are there more? And how does this team, these individuals, come together to make up this team?
There are 17 of us. And There was a smaller group who began the conversation, and then many of us were invited to be part of this expanded group that came together, particularly as we began envisioning this gathering. We will be continuing in conversation together to discern how we'll organize and draw in other leaders and participants and partners as we do the work that we feel we're called to do for UMC Next. Each one of us are bringing different networks, different experience, different strengths. I do have to say, considering that we pulled all of this together in about 4 or 5 weeks, and formed as a team and did all this in 4 or 5 weeks, it was a fairly phenomenal experience working as a team together. And I'm looking forward to kind of how we're going to move the thing forward. Anything else?
A question online. I'd like to ask the panel, what words of advice do you have for the LGBTQIA persons who still have to live in this mess while resistance happens? And what does that resistance look like?
I'll begin by saying one of the hopeful and interesting things that I heard in various parts of the conversation over the last couple of days are creative ways where folks are looking at trying to create safe spaces and landing places for persons who are the most vulnerable. As Adam mentioned before, there are churches and communities that are feeling a great sense of urgency because they really are quite vulnerable and are going to need to be finding ways to connect in creative ways to create some boundary and some safety. So I want to encourage and I speak a word to those who are feeling really vulnerable and nervous and afraid that there are conversations and there's organizing happening and will continue that will create some space, and I hope safe space for you to find safe harbor. And we'll try to do our best to communicate what that is as it continues to develop and become more concrete.
Sure, and just the affirmations of what we stated, especially about not just progressive groups, but even the centrist groups, in now opening space for us who are LGBTQ is very important. So, and eliminating the language that restricts us, the bans, this is what we're hoping to now forge together as one large group so that the church is totally inviting.
I want to say thank you first for your bravery, for choosing to be a part of the United Methodist Church. I want to say you are not alone, and you are loved, and you are made in God's image, and we are better because of you, not despite you. We want to say that we want to learn from you and grow as disciples alongside you, and you are a big reason why we gathered here, and we will work very hard to make sure that every person knows that we love you and we care for you, and our love for Jesus drives us to love everyone that we can in the ways we can. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
I would say on behalf of centrists that there have been a lot of churches who have had a yearning to welcome everyone, but they have been silent. They've sat on the fence. They were unwilling to speak out or to speak up. And General Conference 2019 had a profound impact on thousands and thousands of churches who've said not anymore. This is not okay with us. We are not going to treat people this way. We are not going to say in the year 2019 that gay and lesbian couples raising children in our families are incompatible with Christian teaching. And consequently, there are a whole lot more churches who are saying, many of them who are here saying, we are not going to be quiet anymore. And so I think you'll find a groundswell of people. And there's a reshuffling that's happening, groundswell of churches, and there's a reshuffling that's happening within churches as well. The other day, my wife and I were at a restaurant eating dinner, and a woman stopped at my table, and she tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, I've seen you on the news talking about this, and I want you to know I'm so grateful that you are a pastor here in Kansas City and that you're speaking up on behalf of my transgender son. And I stood up and I thanked her. I said, you go to Church of the Resurrection? She said, no, I'm a Baptist, but when the Baptist church rejected my son, I decided I'm no longer a part of that church. I don't have a church right now, but the church that you talk about is the kind of church I want to be a part of. Have the same conversations with young adults who are saying, finally there's a church in my city who is, and we're not the only one, there are dozens of churches like ours, but who are saying, this is not okay, and we are a church for everyone, and we're going to love and welcome everyone here. And I think that leads to a reshuffling. We're going to lose some members in our churches as a result of that, and we're going to gain folks who are going to say, finally, that's a church I've been wanting to be a part of.
Lastly, I would just say that this really is a clear and clarion call for the church. And Adam talks about centuries. I think of the church to be a church that welcomes people. I think it's a sad day in 2019 when we have to think about, is church a safe place for someone because of their sexual orientation, because of their gender identity? It's a sad day that in 2019 we'll still talk about churches as places of exclusion. That's a sad day when we think about the church as places that still practice discrimination. That it's a sad reality that we live in. I'm in this fight because I want to be a voice for my family members. I want to be a voice for the people that I've pastored. I want to be a voice for the leaders that I've worked alongside, for the persons who've made such a tremendous difference, and for the persons who've made such a difference in my life and helping me to know who Jesus is and helping me to grow in my faith. And what a beautiful opportunity it would be for, as we think about a new expression of Methodism. This is the moment. This is the time that God has called us to for such a time as this.
While you have the mic, you have an interesting role here because you're the general secretary, the head of one of our United Methodist general agencies, particularly the one on discipleship. How does that give you some challenge or opportunity or whatever in terms of being a part of this movement? And how does it connect with the campaign your agency's been doing about See All the People and trying to create a new way for United Methodist churches to see and observe and welcome the communities in which they exist?
Well, I mean, number one, thank you for the question, John. We're very proud of the initiative called See All the People. And, you know, the question we asked for See All the People is what would happen if we stopped fixing churches and started seeing all the people that God has called us to reach. I think we have the right message for this moment and for this time. The challenges that it poses for me as the General Secretary of Discipleship, you know, my responsibility as the General Secretary is to assist leaders in their task, right, of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Well, there's another word in that mission statement as well, to challenge, right, to challenge and support. And so part of what I see as my role in this movement is a challenge, you know, to the church, that we are truly seeing all the people and that we are truly committed, relentlessly focused on the task of making disciples for Jesus Christ. And when we talk about for the transformation of the world, that everyone has an opportunity to participate in that transformative work. So I see that what I do is critical to who we are as a denomination, and I see my role on this team as is critical to that process.
I've got a question on behalf of my colleague, Eric Alsgaard of the Baltimore Washington Conference. He wants to know, does resisting the one church, the traditional plan mean violating the Book of Discipline?
For some of us, resisting the traditionalist plan means violating the Book of Discipline. For some persons in their contexts, it might not. There will be a variety, I understand. There will need to be a wide variety of resistance tactics, all leaning into and seeking to help accomplish the commitments that we have made together here. So for some, yes, there will be violations, there will be those who will risk a lot for the sake of justice and for the sake of loving our LGBTQ siblings and for pushing back against the traditionalist plan. And others will risk other kinds of things, but not, for a variety of reasons, be able or willing at this time to break the rules of the plan, of the discipline.
Let me just say there are many forms of resistance. And what I want people to hear is that the very term resistance is grounded in our baptismal vows. We promise to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. And so there are many forms of resistance, and people have to decide, how they will participate. But what people should hear is that as this movement grows, and as people are joining this movement, there are going to be different, varying levels of resistance depending on where people are.
Resistance looks different in Boston than Baxter Springs, Kansas, or Bowling Green, Kentucky. And so there's going to be room for people to say their resistance may be putting up a sign on the front of their church says, everybody is welcome here. And for others, it will be officiating at same-gender weddings. And for some annual conferences, it'll be ordaining persons who are gay, lesbian clergy. And so that'll take different forms in different places. What will be different is in the past, for many United Methodists across the country, they only saw this at General Conference and maybe annual conference. And today, suddenly, you're going to have thousands and thousands of churches in the United States who are going to say this is not okay, and we stand with gay and lesbian people and against what our church has said in calling them incompatible and treating them as second class.
We need to wrap up. Do you have one more question?
Sorry, this comes from Eric Allsgaard again. He wanted to know, and frankly, I'm sure a lot of other folks know, who sort of paid for this gathering and how much did it cost, if you have an estimate?
So I can answer that. Everyone paid their own way to get here. So there was nobody funding this. Everyone paid their own way to get here. They paid $50, which was the cost for food while they were here. And then the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection assumed the cost for staffing and the facilities cost and all of that. And I think those were all the costs. So there was no general church funding, no annual conference funding that I'm aware of that was funding this event. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I would like to just end with one final question for the convening team. Going forward, what's exciting? What are you excited about?
I'm excited about this new beginning, a new beginning of hope, a new way of how we learn to love each other. That's, for me, what's exciting.
I'm excited by the way that I sense that God is stirring us to be awake to the painful realities and the beautiful possibilities, and to try to really lean into all of that and allow Spirit to help birth something new as we seek to follow Jesus faithfully. And to get to be a part of that, I'm really, really excited.
I'm excited to be a part of offering my loaves and fishes as Jesus had that miracle in the Gospels. And more than my loaves and fishes, I'm excited for witnessing what other people will share in their gifts and their graces. Because I know what we offer, God can do so much more with. And I am positive at the core of who I am that God has a plan for us. God is working in this church and in this world in a way that is beyond my own imagination. And I'm excited to be surprised, to be astounded, and to be hopeful, because I am very hopeful in what is happening now.
I'm excited about where we're heading and the watching us form and reform the United Methodist Church that welcomes everyone and draws them into a relationship with Jesus Christ and a passionate, deep faith in the Wesleyan tradition, a faith that is focused on both what we around here call the evangelical gospel, inviting people into a personal relationship with Christ and seeing their lives transformed, and the social gospel of saying, how are we living as God's hands and feet in the world to transform the world? But I'm also excited about helping give birth to and form a church that my granddaughter one day will be proud to be a member of and not ashamed or embarrassed of.
I'm excited about Jesus, and I'm excited to be a part of a movement that's reflective of God's kingdom, that's truly reflective of persons who are called by God's name. The last couple of days were just so hope-filled, strategic. Our conversations were vulnerable, transparent. They were real, they were deep, they were authentic, and persons were dreaming together about what we could do to continue to grow the body of Christ. That's what I'm most excited about. That even as we leave this place, we're still focused on making disciples and including all of God's children.
Thank you very much for coming.